It was late September when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone. I had been feeling cooped up in the city, surrounded by screens and noise, and I wanted some quiet, something that felt real again. I packed light, just enough gear for 2 nights, and headed into a small patch of forest a couple of hours away from town. It wasn't a popular place, not even listed officially as a campground. I had found it years earlier on a hike and remembered the small clearing near a creek that would make for a good private spot. By the time I parked my car off the dirt road and started hiking in, the sun was already slipping lower behind the trees. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled. The forest had that damp, earthy smell, fallen leaves, moss, old wood, that always hits stronger in the fall. The ground was soft and uneven, and the light faded fast as I walked. I had to stop once or twice to check the map on my phone before the signal disappeared completely. I set up camp in that same clearing I remembered. It was smaller than I thought, with tall trees wrapping around it so tight that it felt enclosed, like being inside a wooden cage. The creek nearby was low and shallow, just a trickle over rocks, but the sound of it was constant. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and sat there as it got dark, watching the flames and letting my thoughts slow down. It was the kind of peace that feels both comforting and slightly unsettling, like being too aware of how far you are from anyone else. The first night was uneventful, just the occasional rustle in the woods and the wind through the branches. I slept well. The next morning, I woke up early, cooked breakfast, and decided to explore a bit. There was a faint path leading away from the clearing that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It was narrow and half covered in leaves, twisting up a small rise before disappearing deeper into the woods. I figured I'd follow it for a while just to see where it went. The higher I climbed, the quieter it got. Even the creek sound faded until there was nothing but the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. The trees grew closer together, and light filtered through in thin, broken strips. It was peaceful but strange in a way that made me feel like I was walking somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. After about 20 minutes, I came across something that made me stop. First, I thought it was trash. There were bits of white paper scattered in the leaves, some burned, others torn to pieces. I crouched down and picked one up. The edges were blackened like it had been caught in a small fire, and when I brushed the dirt off, I saw faint text printed in small letters. Another piece nearby had what looked like a verse number, 14:7, barely legible through the smudge marks. It took a moment to register that they were Bible pages, burnt, shredded, and left there, deep in the woods, off a path that barely existed anymore. I gathered a few of them in my hand, trying to make sense of it. Some still had parts of sentences visible, phrases like, "And he spoke unto them," or "They shall rise again." The words looked eerie against the black burn marks. I don't know why, but it made me uneasy. Someone had brought a Bible out here and tried to destroy it page by page. It wasn't the kind of thing you just stumbled on accidentally. I looked around for any sign of a campfire or trash pile, something that might explain why it was there, but I didn't see anything. Just more trees and the faint outlines of the old path stretching ahead. I pocketed one of the larger scraps and kept walking, though I couldn't shake the strange feeling that I was somewhere personal, like walking into a place where something bad had happened. A few minutes later, I came across what might have been a small campsite once. There was a ring of stones half buried in the dirt, a few old beer cans rusted through, and a piece of rope tied between 2 trees that looked like it had been there for years. Whatever had been here was long abandoned. Still, the area had a heaviness to it, like it carried some leftover tension. I didn't stay long. I turned back, following the same faint trail downhill toward my camp. On the way back, I noticed a few more scraps of burnt paper here and there, as if someone had walked and dropped them along the way. By the time I reached my clearing again, I felt relieved to see my tent and the familiar sight of my fire ring. The rest of the day passed quietly. I spent it fishing along the creek, cooking lunch, and writing a little in my notebook. The air got colder again as the sun dropped, and by evening I was sitting close to the fire, staring at the small scrap of Bible page I'd brought back. I looked up the verse later when I got home, but at that moment, I just kept thinking about who had done it and why. When it got dark, the woods felt heavier than the night before. There was a stillness that didn't feel normal. No crickets, no frogs, not even the faint rustling of small animals. Just silence. It made me uneasy. I stayed close to the fire, feeding it more wood than I probably needed to, just for the light. At some point late in the night, I heard something far off in the woods. It wasn't loud, just a faint sound like something moving slowly through the leaves. Came and went, always just at the edge of hearing. I told myself it was deer or raccoons, but I didn't move from the fire until well past midnight. When I finally went into the tent, I kept my flashlight close and lay there listening. I could hear the creek faintly again and the soft crackle of the fire dying out. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew it was morning and sunlight was coming through the tent fabric. When I stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was that the wind had scattered ash from the fire pit across the clearing. It looked like black paper mixed with gray dust, and for a second it reminded me of those burnt Bible pages. I kicked some dirt over the ashes and started packing up my stuff. On my way out, I decided to walk back up the trail just to check once more, maybe to convince myself it wasn't as strange as I remembered. But when I got to the spot where I'd first found the pages, there was nothing. The scraps were gone. Not a single piece remained. It looked like untouched forest floor, covered in leaves. I stood there for a long minute trying to make sense of it. Maybe the wind had blown them away. Maybe someone else had found them, but it didn't add up. They had been half buried, damp, stuck to the dirt. There was no way they'd all just disappeared overnight. I left soon after, hiking back to my car faster than I'd planned. Later that week, at home, I looked up the verse number I'd seen on one of the pages, 14:7. Came from the book of Job. The verse read something about hope and renewal, about a tree that, even when cut down, would sprout again from its roots. I didn't know what to make of it, but for some reason it unsettled me more than comforted me. I still think about that day sometimes, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Someone had burned that Bible out there and scattered it along an old forgotten path. Someone had walked that same trail before me maybe years ago, leaving behind pieces of something they wanted to destroy or forget. It wasn't terrifying in the way of loud noises or shadows moving in the dark, but it stayed with me. It was the kind of fear that seeps in quietly when you realize how many things happen out there in the woods. Things that no one ever sees, things that get buried by time, by leaves, by the forest growing back around them. I haven't been back to that spot since. Every time I think about it, I can still picture the faint text on that burnt page and the way the forest seemed to swallow the rest of it by morning. It's strange how something so small, just a few scraps of paper, can make you feel like the woods are holding secrets you'll never understand. I went camping alone one spring weekend, not far from a stretch of forest I'd been meaning to explore for a while. It wasn't one of those official campgrounds with picnic tables and marked trails. Just a stretch of mixed pine and alder woods with a thin creek running through. I'd found it on a map weeks earlier, a patch of green that looked isolated enough to get real quiet but still reachable before dark. The whole point of going was to unplug and get away from noise and people. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last few miles were just gravel and potholes, lined with mossy trees and thick brush pressing right up against the road. When I finally pulled over and parked near a wide bend, I could hear the faint rush of water somewhere in the trees. The air smelled damp, full of wet dirt and pine needles. It was already late afternoon, so I didn't waste time picking a direction. I threw on my pack, crossed the ditch, and followed the faint sound of the creek. The terrain sloped down for a while until I found a small clearing right beside the water. It wasn't big, but it was flat enough for a tent, and the sound of the creek made it feel private. I set up camp, built a small fire ring out of stones, and settled in. There wasn't a trail nearby, at least not one I could see, but I noticed a narrow path of trampled grass heading deeper into the woods. It looked faint, like something deer might have made, but I decided I'd follow it in the morning after breakfast. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat by the fire until it was just embers, then crawled into my sleeping bag. The air got colder around midnight, and I could hear the faint drip of water from the trees onto my tent. The creek ran steady. Nothing moved. By morning, the fog had rolled in. Everything looked gray and soft, like the woods were half asleep. I boiled some water, made coffee, and ate a few granola bars before deciding to check out that path I'd seen. The trail led up a gentle incline, winding between thick trunks. The ground was covered in soggy leaves and patches of moss. It wasn't really a proper trail, but it was clear enough that something, animals, maybe people, had used it before. After about 10 minutes, I started noticing things on the ground that didn't belong there. At first, it was just small bits of plastic, wrappers half buried in mud, bottle caps, and a torn strap from what looked like a backpack. The kind of trash you find in forgotten places where someone camped once and never came back to clean it up. But then, as the path curved around a cluster of ferns, I saw something that made me stop. It was a single shoe, mud-caked, flattened, the laces still tied. It was sitting there alone in the middle of the path, like someone had taken it off carefully and walked away barefoot. I don't know why, but something about it bothered me more than it should have. It's not unusual to find junk in the woods, but a single shoe always feels wrong. A few feet past it, I noticed a tangled mess of black tape caught on a low branch. When I got closer, I saw that it was the unwound ribbon from an old cassette tape, twisted and fluttering slightly in the breeze. I followed it a few steps and saw the cracked plastic shell of the tape lying nearby, its label faded and unreadable. That's when I started to get that weird feeling in my stomach. The one that creeps up on you when you realize you're walking through something that doesn't make sense. The ground started to level out again, and ahead of me I saw a patch of bare dirt that looked recently disturbed. I don't mean freshly dug, just cleared, like someone had walked around there more than once. On the edge of it, there was a piece of paper pressed flat against the ground, soaked through from the damp air. When I picked it up, it came apart slightly in my hands. Took me a second to even register what it was. It was a page from a Bible. The thin paper had that same tiny double-column print, and the edges were blackened. Burn marks curled across the surface, stopping just short of where the words began. I turned it over and found another scrap half buried beside it. Same thing, Bible text torn and burnt. I crouched down, scanning the ground, and realized there were more scattered all around, mixed in with leaves and dirt. Some were shredded beyond recognition, others half intact. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the damp air, though I couldn't tell if it was from those pages or just from someone's old fire. Felt wrong to be there. Not dangerous, just wrong in a way that makes your chest tighten a little, like you're intruding on something you don't understand. I don't know what made me keep looking, but I wandered a bit further and found another strange thing. A torn magazine page stuck to a tree root. It was glossy, faded, waterlogged, but the image was unmistakable. A piece of some old hardcore porn spread. The colors were washed out, the ink running, but it was there, half buried in the dirt like everything else. It didn't take long before I realized this area was littered with random, unrelated objects. A piece of rope, a crushed beer can, the heel of another shoe, and something that might have been part of a blanket once. Nothing made sense together, yet they were all within 20 feet of each other. It felt like a dumping ground, but not for garbage. More like the remnants of different moments, different people, all ending up in one quiet spot. I stood there for a while, trying to piece it together in my head. Maybe some kids came up here years ago and burned things for fun. Maybe it was just one of those places that slowly collects leftovers from whoever passes through. But the way it was spread out didn't feel accidental. I picked up one of the Bible pages, folded it gently, and tucked it into my pocket. Not because I wanted it, but because something about leaving it there felt worse. When I finally turned back toward camp, the woods seemed quieter. The fog had started to lift, but the air was still heavy and still. Every few steps, I thought I heard faint movement behind me. A branch creaking, a leaf crunching. But whenever I stopped, it went silent again. Could have been animals. Probably was. But I remember feeling watched. That subtle awareness that tightens the back of your neck when you know something's close but unseen. When I got back to camp, the clearing looked the same, except the creek seemed louder, like it was pushing harder over the rocks. I made lunch, trying to shake the uneasy feeling, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the trees. It was like the woods had changed, like they weren't just trees anymore. They were hiding things, holding them in. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. Every sound made me tense up. A twig snapping, the low hum of the creek, even the shifting fabric of my tent. I kept picturing that single shoe, the burnt pages, the scattered trash. It wasn't the objects themselves that got to me, but the thought of how they all ended up together in one forgotten spot. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. When I woke up early the next morning, the fire pit had filled halfway with cold water from the dew. The forest felt normal again. Birds were calling, light filtered through the canopy, and for a few minutes, I almost convinced myself I'd overthought it all. As I packed up my tent, I pulled that Bible scrap out of my pocket to throw it into the fire before I left. The damp paper resisted the flame for a moment before curling in on itself and turning black. I stood there watching it crumble into ash, wondering if whoever left it behind had done the same thing years ago, trying to get rid of something they didn't want to remember. On the hike back to the car, I passed the spot where I'd found the first shoe, but it was gone. The ground was bare except for a few scattered leaves. I didn't stop this time. I just kept walking until I saw my car through the trees. I didn't tell anyone about it afterward. There wasn't much to tell. Really, no clear story, no dramatic ending. Just a small, forgotten stretch of forest full of strange, disconnected things. But sometimes when I think back on it, I get the same uneasy feeling I had that day. It's not fear of ghosts or anything like that. It's the realization that there are places out there where pieces of people's lives just end up. Shoes, pages, rope, tape, bits of stories with no explanations. They sit there in the dirt, rotting quietly while the forest grows over them again. And you only ever see them if you happen to wander a little too far off the trail. That camping trip still feels burned into my memory, even though it's been years. It started as one of those easy, carefree weekends where everything is supposed to be about relaxing. Friends, fire, food, and being far from anyone else. We had driven deep into the woods, following a rough dirt road that narrowed until the branches brushed both sides of the truck. It was early summer, and the air smelled heavy with pine and damp earth. The spot we picked was right next to a small creek that ran steady and cold, shallow enough that you could hear it moving over the rocks even from the tent. There were 5 of us on that trip. We'd known each other since high school, and camping together was something we did almost every year. It was the same kind of trip every time. Too much drinking, too much smoke, and just enough food to last a few days. My buddy had brought some smoked venison his uncle had given him, sealed in a bag and already cooked. It smelled incredible, even before we put it over the fire. That night, the air was perfectly still, the kind of quiet that makes the sound of a crackling fire feel louder. We'd set up camp early in the evening, built a solid fire ring, and arranged a few logs into seats. The creek was maybe 10 or 15 feet from the fire, close enough to hear it, but far enough that the smoke didn't blow over the water. I remember how good the venison tasted, salty, smoky, a little sweet. We sat there eating and drinking, the fire reflecting off the water and throwing light across the trees. It was one of those moments that felt perfect in its simplicity. When we were done eating, there was still a lot of meat left. We joked about how much we had, everyone too full and too drunk to really care about packing it away. I figured someone would wrap it up before bed. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the night grew darker, the kind of dark that feels thicker the longer you stare into it. We stayed up late, passing bottles around, laughing and losing track of time. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the air had cooled, and the forest had gone silent except for the sound of the creek. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong there. It started as low growling and snapping, quick, sharp sounds of something moving fast and hard through the brush. I lay there for a few seconds trying to make sense of it. It wasn't wind. It wasn't people. It was the kind of sound that makes the hair on your neck rise instantly. Then I heard a high-pitched squeal followed by another growl, deeper this time, and then the distinct sound of splashing in the creek. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. The air outside felt colder, and the smell hit me before the light did. Wet earth, smoke, and something else underneath it, something strong and musky. When I turned the flashlight toward the creek, the beam caught movement everywhere. Two animals were fighting right in the shallow water, shapes twisting, lunging, snapping at each other. I couldn't tell what they were at first, maybe a raccoon and something larger. The noise was violent, raw, echoing across the trees. Then I noticed the glowing eyes beyond them. When the light swept past the creek and into the woods, I saw eyes staring back, dozens of them, reflecting that pale yellow and green shine you only see in animals at night. They were scattered all around the perimeter of our camp, some high in the trees, some low to the ground, all completely still, watching. The more I looked, the more I saw. They surrounded us from every direction, a wide circle of eyes glinting in the dark. Took me a moment to understand what was happening. The leftover meat, someone had tossed it in the creek. The smell must have carried for miles, drifting through the forest and down the water. Every predator, scavenger, and hungry creature nearby had followed it right to us. The sounds grew louder. I could hear the splashing, the snapping of jaws, the low growl of something big just beyond the light. The flashlight beam caught flashes of fur, coyotes, raccoons, a fox, maybe even a bobcat. Their movements were jerky and erratic, like they were competing for something in the water. The sound of tearing filled the air, wet and rough. I felt my stomach twist. Behind me, the tents were still. Everyone else was passed out, completely unaware of what was happening a few feet away. I didn't dare call out. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The only thing between me and that chaos was the thin layer of light from my flashlight and the dying fire. The creek water was dark and churning. I could see the shredded remains of the venison floating downstream, pieces caught between rocks. The animals were frantic now, fighting for every bit they could find. The sound of their claws scraping over stone, the slap of tails and paws in water, it all blended into something primal and chaotic. I took a slow step backward toward the tent, keeping the light moving in small circles. Every time I stopped, I caught more eyes blinking back at me, silent and still, waiting. Then one of the shapes moved closer to camp. It was large, too large to be a fox or coyote. It stepped just far enough into the light that I could see the outline of a deer's body, its legs trembling as it stared toward the creek. Behind it, smaller shapes darted through the shadows. It felt like the entire forest had come alive. The smell grew worse, stronger, almost suffocating. A mix of wet fur, mud, and blood. My heartbeat was so loud in my chest I could barely hear anything else. I backed up slowly until I was inside the tent again, zipped it shut, and sat there gripping the flashlight. I didn't sleep after that. I just listened. For hours, the sounds continued outside. The growls, the splashing, the crunch of bones and tearing. Every once in a while, something brushed past the tent, just enough to make the nylon ripple. I stayed completely still. The fire had burned down completely by then, and without the light, the darkness felt absolute. I could only see faint glints of movement through the thin fabric of the tent when I turned the flashlight off. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the noise started to fade. The creek went quiet again, just the steady sound of water moving over rocks. When I finally dared to unzip the tent, the air was still. The sky had that early gray light of dawn, soft and colorless. The fire pit was cold. The ground around the creek was torn up. Mud, paw prints, feathers, fur, even a bit of blood in the water. The smell still hung there, sour and heavy. Whatever was left of the meat was gone. The water was cloudy and red in places. You could see tracks from at least a dozen different animals, maybe more, all overlapping, leading in and out of the same spot. I stood there for a long time, staring at the mess, trying to understand how close we'd come to something worse. We were lucky none of them had gone after the tents. Maybe they were too focused on the food, or maybe they didn't see us as a threat. Either way, I knew we couldn't stay there another night. When everyone finally woke up, I didn't even have to say anything. They stepped out of the tents, looked at the ground, and went quiet. We packed up fast that morning, no joking, no music, no more drinking. By the time the sun was fully up, the site looked normal again, like nothing had happened, except for the churned up mud near the water. It's strange how something so simple, a bit of leftover meat, can pull every living thing out of the forest and right to your camp. That night taught me more about the woods than any other trip I've ever been on. The forest never sleeps, and it's always listening. You might think you're alone out there, sitting by your fire, tucked away from the world, but you're not. Everything around you can smell, hear, and feel you long before you ever notice them. That night, I realized how small we really are out there. We weren't camping near the wild, we were right in the middle of it. And for a few hours, when the forest closed in around us and the eyes reflected back from the dark, it felt like every animal on that mountain knew exactly where we were. I was around 10 years old when this happened, back when summer felt endless and the world still seemed like a safe place. I was at a week-long summer camp deep in the woods, one of those old-fashioned places where everything smelled like pine sap, lake water, and campfire smoke. The cabins were rough, the food was average, and the counselors were older teenagers who acted more like older brothers than actual authority figures. Most nights we stayed in the cabins, but one night near the end of the week, they announced that our group would be going on an overnight campout a mile or so from the main camp. It sounded like an adventure, and at that age, anything that took us deeper into the woods felt exciting. We packed light sleeping bags, flashlights, canteens, and a few snacks. The counselors carried the rest: a tarp, some rope, a hatchet, and a cooler of food for breakfast. It was a short hike, but to 10-year-old legs it felt longer. The air smelled thick and green, like damp leaves and earth. It was still hot, but under the trees it felt cooler, the light soft and broken by branches. The trail narrowed as we walked until it was barely more than a dirt path worn down by years of kids doing the same thing. When we got to the campsite, it was a small clearing surrounded by dense brush and tall trees. You could barely see more than a few yards into the woods. The counselors had us set up tarps instead of tents, lean-tos they called them. They tied ropes between trees and draped the tarps over them, staking them down at the edges. We laid our sleeping bags inside, open to the air on one side, protected only by the slant of the tarp above. It felt primitive, and for some reason that made it more fun. The night came on slow. We sat around the fire roasting marshmallows, the flames throwing soft light on everyone's faces. The smell of smoke mixed with pine needles, and bugs buzzed lazily around the edges of the light. Somewhere out in the dark, you could hear frogs croaking and the occasional snap of something moving through the brush. Every sound in the woods at night has a way of standing out, and even though I told myself it was just small animals, there was always that quiet edge of unease. By the time the fire burned down to glowing embers, everyone was getting sleepy. We crawled into our sleeping bags, flashlights tucked beside us just in case. The air had cooled, and the forest felt heavier, wrapped in the hum of crickets and distant sounds that didn't belong to any one direction. I remember lying there, staring up at the dim outline of the tarp above me, the faint glow from the dying fire flickering on the underside of it. Sometime during the night, I woke up. I don't remember why. Maybe the cold, maybe just a shift in the sounds around me. For a second, I didn't move, trying to figure out what time it was. The sky through the trees looked black, not even a hint of dawn yet. Everything was quiet except for the soft breathing of the other kids and the occasional crackle from the fire pit. Then I heard it, footsteps. They were slow and heavy, coming from somewhere off to my right, maybe just beyond the ring of lean-tos. The sound wasn't like a squirrel or a raccoon. It was deeper, heavier, like someone or something big was moving through the brush. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be the counselor's black lab. The dog had followed us on the hike earlier that evening and had been wandering around the camp while we were setting up. Maybe it had come back, sniffing around for food. The footsteps grew louder, crunching through dry leaves. I could hear the brush shifting, branches snapping under weight. My heart was beating hard, but I stayed still, telling myself not to be stupid, that it was just the dog. Then, from one of the other lean-tos a few feet away, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Someone had turned on a mag light. The bright, narrow cone moved slowly over the ground, tracing through the brush. I could see the kid holding it, a shape in his sleeping bag, sitting up, the light trembling slightly in his hand. He must have heard it too. The beam scanned across the trees, over roots, stumps, and piles of leaves. For a second, I caught movement in the corner of the light, something darting fast through the shadows. The light jerked back, searching for it again. I could hear the crunch of movement, the sound of something circling just beyond the edge of the light. Then it stopped. The woods went dead quiet again. The beam of the flashlight settled on one spot, and there, about 15 feet away, was something standing still. The kid's hand steadied the light. I squinted, trying to see clearly, and finally made out what it was: a wild turkey. Big, round body, dark feathers shining faintly, long neck stretched out like it was staring back at us. For a moment, I felt my muscles relax. Turkey wasn't scary. It was weird, but not dangerous. I was just thinking that, half asleep, when it moved. The turkey suddenly lowered its body and charged straight toward the lean-to. The sound it made, those rapid, thudding footsteps pounding the ground, cut through the quiet. The mag light swung wildly as the kid holding it screamed. The light flashed across the trees, across our tarps, then down to the ground where the turkey hit the lean-to full force. The sound was chaos. Feathers, flapping, that deep, angry gobble, 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 echoing through the clearing. I could hear the tarp rattling, the thuds of the bird's body slamming into it, the kid scrambling inside his sleeping bag trying to get away. For a few seconds, the light spun across everything, the trees, the ground, flashes of movement, but mostly it was just noise and confusion. I couldn't move. I was frozen, watching the beam of light jerk around the camp, catching only flashes of feathers and motion. The turkey's gobbles sounded furious, echoing like it was right on top of us. It went on for maybe 20 seconds, though it felt longer. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The woods went silent again. The beam of light dropped, and everything was still. No one said a word. There was only the sound of the kids' heavy breathing and the faint rustle of leaves where the turkey had come from. I lay there, staring at the dark, not sure if it had really happened or if I dreamed it. After a while, I must have fallen asleep again, still half expecting to hear it come back. When I woke up, the sun was already climbing through the trees, thin beams of light cutting through the clearing. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and ash from the fire. A few kids were already up, sitting around the campfire's remains, poking at the ashes with sticks. I sat down with them, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. I was about to tell them about what I thought had been the strange dream I'd had. A wild turkey charging through the camp, a flashlight swinging around, but before I could even start, I saw one of the other kids walking toward us from the lean-to. It was the same one who'd had the flashlight the night before. His hair was a mess, bits of leaves stuck in it, his arms and face covered in scratches. His shirt was torn on one side, dirt smudged down the front. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept at all. I just stared at him, realizing it hadn't been a dream after all. The whole thing had been real, the footsteps, the light, the turkey, everything. Around his lean-to, the ground was torn up, the tarp bent out of shape and dirt scattered everywhere. Later, while we packed up the camp and the counselors joked about how wildlife can get curious, I kept thinking about how close that turkey had come to all of us. At 10 years old, it was hard to process something like that. A bird that big attacking in the middle of the night. It was funny to the adults, but at the time, it felt like chaos. Something wild and unpredictable breaking through the edge of our safe little world. Even now, years later, I can still picture it clearly. The beam of the flashlight shaking through the dark, the sound of that heavy body crashing into the tarp, and that harsh, furious gobbling echoing through the night. It's one of those childhood memories that never really fades, no matter how old you get. And every time I camp out under the open sky, even with a tent zipped up tight, I still listen to the woods a little more carefully than I used to, half expecting to hear those heavy footsteps again. I was camping alone when it happened. It wasn't my first solo trip, but it was the first one where I went that deep into the woods. I'd parked my truck at a small pull-off near the end of a Forest Service road, loaded my pack, and followed a game trail that led away from the main area. My plan was simple. 2 nights out there, no distractions, no noise, just a fire, some food, and the sound of the forest. The place I picked was quiet, far enough from the road that I couldn't hear any cars, just the steady hum of insects and the soft creaking of trees moving in the wind. The spot I found to camp wasn't perfect, but it felt right. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, the ground soft with a mix of moss and fallen needles. I set my tent up a few yards from a large, flat rock that looked like it had once been part of a stream bed. You could tell by the way it dipped slightly and how the ground nearby sloped downward, as if water used to flow through there years ago. The air smelled thick with sap and damp soil, the kind of scent that sticks to your clothes after a few hours. After setting up my camp, I gathered some deadfall for a fire. That's when I noticed it. About 200 feet away, through the trees, there was something pale lying in the grass. At first, I thought it was a log or a patch of fungus catching the afternoon light, but when I looked closer, I could see it wasn't that. The shape was too uneven. I walked toward it, pushing through the brush, the smell hitting me before I even got close. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The carcass was torn open, the body twisted unnaturally. One of its hind legs bent backward like it had been broken in half. Its ribcage was split open, the bones slick and red, the insides ripped out and half gone. The rest of the animal looked shredded, chunks of fur and muscle scattered in the grass around it. There were flies everywhere, the air buzzing with that thick, droning sound they make when they swarm something dead. The smell was awful, sweet and rotten, heavy enough that I had to breathe through my mouth. I crouched down a few feet away, trying to make sense of it. I've seen roadkill before, even deer carcasses left behind by hunters, but this looked different. It didn't look clean or precise. Whatever had done it had torn into the animal like it was nothing. The edges of the wounds were jagged, and there were no obvious signs of a bullet or arrow. The legs and midsection were pulled apart, like something had dragged the pieces. What bothered me most was how fresh it looked. The blood was still wet, dark, and shiny under the light. Couldn't have been there long. I walked around it slowly, looking for prints in the dirt, but the ground was uneven. Pine needles, leaves, and rocks. Nothing clear. The only thing that stood out were drag marks, faint but noticeable, leading from the far side of the carcass toward a thicker patch of woods. I followed them for a few feet until they disappeared into the brush. I couldn't tell what direction they went after that. It started getting late by then, the sun dipping low enough that the light turned gold between the trees. I walked back to my camp, trying to shake off the image of the deer. I kept thinking it must have been coyotes or maybe a bear. It's the woods. Things kill and eat each other all the time. Still, there was something about the way that deer looked that unsettled me. It didn't seem like scavenging. It looked violent, almost deliberate. As the evening settled in, the woods grew quiet. That thick silence that only comes right after sunset hung over everything. I got my fire going, cooked a small meal, and sat watching the flames. The light flickered across the trees, and for a while it felt peaceful again. But every now and then I'd catch myself glancing toward the direction where the carcass was. It was far enough away that I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. The smell of rot carried faintly on the breeze, mixing with the smoke from my fire. When it got fully dark, I put the fire out until it was just embers. The woods sounded alive again, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. It should have been calming, but instead it made me feel exposed. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig stood out sharp in the darkness. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint at first, something moving through the brush. The sound was low and steady, like something heavy stepping over leaves and twigs. My tent was zipped shut, and I could see nothing but the faint outline of trees against the dim sky through the fabric. I lay completely still, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. There was nothing for a long time. Then I heard another sound, something dragging. A slow, rough scrape, like weight being pulled across dirt. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped again. I held my breath, my heart beating fast enough that I could hear it in my ears. Whatever it was close, too close. I thought about unzipping the tent just enough to look, but the fear of making any noise kept me frozen. The dragging sound started again, fainter now, moving away this time. After a while, it faded completely, and the forest went silent again. I didn't sleep much after that. I must have drifted off at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, the sky was pale and the sun was starting to rise. The air was cold and still. I crawled out of the tent and stretched, my body stiff from the night before. The first thing I did, without even thinking about it, was look toward where I'd seen the deer carcass. It was gone. I walked over slowly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing or not seeing. The clearing where it had been was completely empty. The grass was pressed down where the body had been lying, but that was it. No blood, no bones, no fur, not even a patch of torn earth. It was like the deer had never been there at all. I stood there for a while, just staring. 200 pounds of animal doesn't just vanish overnight. Even if scavengers had come, there would have been something left. Bits of bone, hide, at least some blood. But there was nothing. The flies were gone too, which made it even stranger. The air didn't even smell bad anymore. It was as if the whole scene had been wiped clean. I walked a few yards into the trees, checking for drag marks again, but the ground looked untouched. No disturbed leaves, no broken branches, just untouched forest floor. I felt a cold, uneasy feeling spread through my stomach, the kind of feeling that makes you realize you don't belong somewhere. I packed my gear quickly after that. Every sound around me seemed sharper. The creak of my tent poles, the crunch of my boots, the whisper of wind in the branches. I kept looking over my shoulder as I worked, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. When I finally started back toward the trail, I caught one last whiff of that faint, sickly sweet smell of rot. It was distant, carried by the wind, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I didn't stop to look for it. I made it back to the truck just as the sun was climbing higher, and when I finally shut the door and turned the key, I felt that rush of relief that only comes when you know you're leaving something behind. On the drive back, I kept thinking about what could have taken that deer. Maybe it was a bear, maybe coyotes working together, maybe even someone out there doing something I didn't want to understand. But what's stuck with me ever since isn't just the sight of that shredded carcass. It's how clean the ground looked the next morning, like something had come through and erased every trace of what happened. I've camped plenty of times since then, but I never set up that close to anything dead anymore. Out there, when you see signs of a kill, you move, because whatever made it, whatever tore that deer apart and carried it off into the dark, it's still out there, and it's not something you want to meet in the night. I remember that weekend clearer than most. It started out as one of those easygoing camping trips we did a few times a year. Nothing fancy, just primitive camping, no hookups, no running water, just the basics. My wife and I liked getting away from everything, finding those quiet dirt roads where you're more likely to hear a branch snap than see another person. We brought our dog as usual, and this time we decided to invite a few friends to make it a longer, more social trip. We drove out on a Thursday afternoon, all packed up with coolers, tents, and too much beer. The dirt road that led to the campsites was narrow and winding, maybe 6 or 7 miles from the nearest paved road. The sites were spaced far apart, each one tucked back into the trees just enough that you couldn't see your neighbors. That's what we liked about it. No crowds, no noise except the wind and the crickets. We picked a site halfway down the road, near a small stream that ran behind a low ridge. We set up camp, started a fire, and spent the evening drinking, laughing, and cooking over the flames. It was peaceful, a little too quiet at times, but peaceful. When the sun went down, the whole forest turned pitch black except for the flicker of our fire. The air smelled like pine smoke and damp leaves. Sometime after dark, we heard a vehicle coming down the road. At first, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. The road was open to campers, and there were several other sites down that way. But the sound didn't match what we were used to hearing. It wasn't the steady hum of a pickup or SUV. It was lower, heavier, and it rattled in a strange, uneven way, like something big that had been running too long. We all stopped talking for a second and listened. The headlights appeared through the trees, bouncing along the road. Then the vehicle came into view for a few seconds as it passed our site. An old truck, the kind used for meat packing or ice cream deliveries decades ago. It was this faded beige color, rust eating away at the corners, and all the lettering had been stripped off or painted over. The metal sides looked greasy, like old oil stains that had never been washed off. There were no plates on the back, no numbers, no company name, just an empty rectangle where the tag should have been. None of us got a good look at the driver. The windshield glare and the way it passed kept the person hidden, but we all saw enough to know it wasn't a normal sight for a remote forest road like that. The truck rolled past slow, maybe 15 miles per hour, and the sound faded into the distance. We just sat there for a minute, waiting to hear it reach the end of the road or turn around, but it never came back. We joked a little to shake off the weirdness, saying stuff like maybe it was a park ranger in disguise or some old farmer lost in the woods, but nobody really laughed. There was something about it that didn't feel right. Eventually, we just shrugged it off and went back to our drinks, trying to forget it. The forest around us was still too still for how late it was getting. The night went on. We stayed up late, the fire burning low, the dog sleeping beside the cooler. Every once in a while, I'd look toward the road, expecting to see headlights again, but nothing came, just the dark. When we finally went to bed, I remember lying there listening to the quiet, waiting for that engine sound to come back. It never did. The next morning started like any normal camping morning. Cold air, coffee, the smell of damp ash from the fire pit. Everyone looked a little tired, but the mood was better. The weirdness from the night before had faded with daylight. We were cooking breakfast when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. It was my mom calling. She was panicked, more than I'd ever heard her. I stepped away from camp and listened as she told me she'd seen a news alert about some hikers who'd been abducted near where we were camping. I didn't understand at first, thought she was exaggerating. But then she said the location. The names hadn't been released, just 2 young women last seen near a primitive camping area off the parkway. I felt this cold sinking feeling in my chest. I pulled up my GPS and checked the coordinates of our site, then opened the article she mentioned. The last known location of the hikers was just over half a mile from us, maybe a 15-minute walk through the woods. It didn't feel real. I went back to camp, trying to act normal, but my head was spinning. My wife noticed immediately that something was wrong. I told her what my mom had said, and everyone else got quiet. Suddenly, every sound around us, every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt heavier. We looked around like we expected someone to be standing at the edge of the trees. The memory of that truck came flooding back. The old faded beige truck with no plates, moving slow down that one-way road. None of us said anything about it out loud, but I could see the same thought in everyone's faces. We stayed close together after that, not wandering off from camp, not hiking. The fun was gone. The place that had felt peaceful the day before now felt suffocating. We barely spoke for the rest of the morning. The dog kept pacing near the tree lean, ears up, watching something we couldn't see. By midday, we decided to pack up and leave. It wasn't even a question. No one wanted to stay another night. The road was as empty as it had been the night before. When we passed the other campsites on the way out, most of them were vacant. I remember looking at each one as we drove, wondering if the hikers had been camping at one of those spots. Back home, I kept checking the news for updates. They confirmed later that week that one of the missing hikers had been found alive, but tied to a tree deep in the woods. The other wasn't found for several days. The police released a brief statement saying they were looking for an unidentified suspect driving an unmarked delivery-style truck. That was all they said. The description matched what we'd seen exactly: old, beige, faded paint, no company name, no plates. I remember feeling this mix of anger and disbelief, thinking how close that thing had passed us, how easily it could have stopped at our site instead. I never saw another article about it after that. The investigation seemed to fade from the news. They never said if they caught anyone. Every now and then, I try to look it up again, but there's barely anything left online about it now, just fragments, old message board posts, a few archived headlines. What gets me most is that I can't remember exactly what happened after we packed up that morning. The memory just stops around then, like my brain doesn't want to replay it in full. Maybe nothing else happened, maybe that was enough to make me block it out. But sometimes, when I think back to that night and how dark it was, I can almost hear that old truck idling somewhere far off down the road. Not moving, just waiting. It's strange how something so simple, like an engine passing by, can stay with you years later. Every time we go camping now, even in busy campgrounds, I find myself checking the road every time I hear an engine. I look for plates, I look for markings, I listen for that uneven rattle in the exhaust. We still go camping, but I can't relax out there anymore. I used to love the silence, the way the woods swallowed sound, how you could sit by a fire and forget about everything. Now that same silence feels like it's hiding something. It's too easy to imagine a truck rolling slow through the trees. Lights off, engine humming, the driver watching from the dark. No ghosts, no creatures, just a person. Someone who knew that road, who knew no one would see them out there. Someone who used that isolation the same way we did, just for a different reason. And that's what really stuck with me, because we thought we were alone out there. We weren't. And whoever was driving that old beige truck, they knew it too. That summer was one of the strangest and most unsettling of my life. I was working on a project monitoring amphibian larvae in vernal pools, temporary bodies of water that form in spring and early summer, shallow and usually gone by late August. The job sounded peaceful enough when I first took it. I imagined early mornings walking through quiet woods, the sun coming through the trees, fog lifting off the water while I crouched to check my traps. I thought it would be the kind of work where solitude would be calming. It didn't take long before I realized just how wrong I was about that. Most of the pools I had to monitor were far out in the middle of large stretches of state land. The kind of land that looked untouched if you didn't know what to look for. Old logging roads ran through the forest in crooked, crumbling lines, and there were overgrown ATV trails that looked like they hadn't been used in years. There were no houses nearby, no sounds of traffic, no cell signal. When I parked my truck at the gate each morning and started walking with my equipment, the sound of the engine fading behind me always gave me that small twinge of discomfort. The realization that if something went wrong out there, I was completely alone. I carried a GPS, a field notebook, a few tools for collecting samples, and a small cooler for temporary storage. I'd spend hours moving from one pool to another, wading into the shallow water to check for tadpoles, marking down notes about temperature and conditions. It was routine after a few weeks, but no matter how used to it I got, there was always this low, uneasy feeling that came from being that deep in the woods with no one else around. The deeper parts of that land weren't just empty wilderness. You could tell people had been using those places for things they weren't supposed to. There were illegal dumps everywhere. Piles of old tires, rusted metal, furniture, and construction debris scattered in small clearings. Sometimes I'd find weirdly specific things that didn't make sense together. A single baby shoe in the mud, piles of empty chew cans, stacks of decaying magazines, random clothes hanging from low branches like someone had been trying to dry them. I even found a refrigerator once, half buried in weeds. A few spots looked like they had been used for camping or maybe for worse reasons. Scattered beer cans, fire pits surrounded by half-melted plastic, and the kind of trash you didn't want to touch. Once, I found syringes near a small stream, just lying there in the dirt next to a few bent spoons and a tarp that looked like it had been used as a tent. I tried not to think too much about who had been there or what had happened, but being out there alone, those details had a way of sticking in your mind. Every snap twig behind me or sudden rustle in the brush made me tense up. One morning in late July, I was sent to check a series of pools that were more remote than most. I parked at the edge of an old dirt road that had nearly vanished under grass and started hiking deeper into the woods. It was already warm, the air thick and heavy with humidity, mosquitoes buzzing around my ears no matter how much repellent I used. I had to follow deer trails for most of the way, narrow paths barely wide enough for one person, winding through dense ferns and fallen branches. After about an hour of hiking, I found the first pool and started collecting data like usual. The water was still and shallow, reflecting the pale sky through the trees. I crouched beside it, scooped up a few larvae with a small net, took the measurements I needed, and moved on. It was quiet except for the sound of insects. The farther I went, the quieter everything got. No birds, no wind, just that heavy stillness that only happens in the middle of nowhere. Around midday, I stopped to drink some water and check my GPS. I was about 5 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by nothing but trees and brush in every direction. The next pool on my list was just past a small ridge, so I started climbing the slope slowly, using tree trunks for balance. When I reached the top, I stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I saw it. Down in the small clearing on the other side of the ridge, standing upright in the middle of the open space, was a baby stroller. At first, I didn't process what I was seeing. It was so out of place that my brain tried to make sense of it as something else. Maybe a piece of junk or an old cart or part of a dump pile. But no, it was unmistakably a baby stroller. The fabric was faded but still clean. The metal frame shiny enough to show it hadn't been sitting there long. It was positioned perfectly upright, like someone had just stepped away from it. I froze on the ridge, staring down at it. There was no sound anywhere, not even a bird. The stroller was maybe 20 feet from the edge of the trees, just sitting there on a patch of flattened grass. I scanned the area around it, but there were no footprints, no signs of people, no tire marks or tracks leading up to it. The ground was soft and would have shown prints easily, but there was nothing. It looked like it had just appeared there. I walked down slowly, every step making me more uneasy. The closer I got, the more details I noticed. There were small toys in the storage area underneath. A rattle, a plastic ring with colored beads, a small stuffed bear that was still bright and not weathered by rain. In the main seat of the stroller was a folded blanket, clean and dry, the kind of blanket you'd use to keep a baby warm. I just stood there staring at it for a long time, trying to understand why it was there. There was no road nearby, no campsite, no sign of anyone for miles. Even the logging roads were too far away to push something like that through the woods. The idea that someone had dragged a baby stroller 5 miles through deer trails made no sense. A sick, heavy feeling started to build in my stomach. The silence of the woods around me made it worse. Every direction I looked felt wrong. The shadows between the trees, the tall grass, the still water not far away. I kept expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. I remember my hands shaking slightly as I took out my phone and snapped a photo, partly so I'd have proof of what I saw, partly because it felt like something I should document for the report. After that, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I just backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on it the entire time until I was back on the ridge. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to listen for any sound, footsteps, voices, anything, but there was nothing, just that thick, unmoving quiet. I didn't finish the rest of my survey that day. I turned around and walked back to my truck, faster than usual, but still trying to stay quiet. Every sound of branches cracking under my boots made my chest tighten. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half convinced someone would appear behind me. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors immediately, even though there was no one around. I sat there for a while with the engine running, just trying to calm down. It's strange. I'd seen so many weird things out there that summer, from old furniture to trash piles to things that hinted at drug use, but nothing made my skin crawl the way that stroller did. I reported it to my supervisor later that day, but there wasn't much to say. I gave them the coordinates and the photo, and that was it. No one seemed particularly alarmed. Out in the woods, people dump all kinds of strange things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. Over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about it. I even thought about going back to check if it was still there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something about the image of that stroller, perfectly upright, clean, surrounded by untouched forest, was too unsettling. It didn't belong there. It didn't make sense. When the season ended and the project wrapped up, I went home and started a new job. Months passed, but that image never left my mind. Every once in a while, I'd scroll through my old photos from the summer, and when I reached that one picture, the stroller standing alone in the middle of the clearing, I'd feel that same quiet dread I felt the moment I saw it. It wasn't fear of something supernatural. It was fear of what was real, of the possibility that someone had been there not long before me, maybe watching, maybe hiding just out of sight. That stroller wasn't old or abandoned for years. It had been placed there recently, and I think that's what bothered me most. Knowing that somewhere out there, 5 miles from the nearest road, someone had brought a baby stroller deep into the woods, left it standing upright with toys and a blanket still inside, and then walked away, leaving no trace of themselves behind. I've spent most of my life outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, hunting. Those things have always felt more natural to me than sitting behind a desk or being stuck in a crowded city. I grew up in a family that spent more weekends in the woods than at home, and by the time I was an adult, being deep in the wilderness was second nature. I know how to build a fire in the rain, find dry wood when everything's soaked, and tell the weather by the smell of the air. I've spent enough nights under open skies that the dark doesn't bother me anymore. Where I live, there are some of the best backpacking trails in the country. High mountain lakes, endless ridges, quiet pine forests, and that clean, sharp air that only exists at elevation. The kind of wilderness that humbles you. You can hike for miles and not see another person all day. 2 years ago, my friend and I decided to take on one of our favorite loops, about 16 miles total, climbing up through dense forest and winding along a series of alpine lakes before circling back down into the lower valley. It was late summer, maybe early September. The days were still warm, but you could feel that thin chill in the air after sundown that meant fall wasn't far off. The trail was in great shape and we'd made good time getting up to the higher lakes. By the time we reached the spot we planned to camp, the sun was starting to slip behind the ridge, and the whole forest had that golden kind of light that makes everything look quiet and still. We found a perfect place to set up camp near the edge of a lake. The water was clear, like glass, reflecting the trees and mountains perfectly. There was a small stretch of flat ground that someone else had clearly used before. The dirt was packed down, a small fire ring built out of rocks. We set up the tents, got a fire going, and started thinking about fishing before it got too dark. We'd both brought lightweight spinning rods, and the lake was known for good trout. I grabbed mine and started walking along the tree line, looking for an open spot near where the water dropped off deeper. That's when we saw it. It stood out immediately, a white object sitting in the middle of the woods about 100 feet from camp. At first, I thought maybe it was a cooler or a bucket someone had left behind, but when we got closer, I realized what it actually was. It was a toilet, a full-sized porcelain toilet sitting by itself in the forest. It was perfectly upright, resting on a little wooden platform built from what looked like old plywood. Someone had actually taken the time to dig a deep hole beneath it, almost like a pit latrine, and set the toilet right over it. I just stood there staring at it for a while, trying to process it. It was one of the strangest things I'd ever seen out in the backcountry. We were miles from any road, deep in an area where you'd have to hike for hours carrying everything on your back. So the thought of someone hauling an entire porcelain toilet up there was absurd. It didn't even look old. The surface was still bright white, clean, not cracked or chipped. No leaves or dirt built up inside. No spider webs or signs of animals. It looked like it had just been placed there a few days ago. The thing that made it even weirder was the location. The toilet sat maybe 40 or 50 feet above the lake's edge, in a small clearing between trees. If the water level ever rose, and you could see high water marks from previous years, that spot would easily be flooded. On a bad rain year, that whole area could have been underwater. The setup looked deliberate though. The platform had been cut and leveled carefully, not something slapped together. Someone had measured and planned it. The pit underneath was deep enough that it must have taken a lot of effort to dig. It was one of those strange moments in the outdoors where your brain doesn't know what category to put something in. I've seen all kinds of weird stuff in the backcountry, rusted cars, old mining equipment, even remnants of old cabins. But this was different. It wasn't historic or natural. It was new, functional, and incredibly out of place. Still, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. We were miles deep in the wilderness, surrounded by trees and untouched nature, and someone had gone through all that work just to have a proper toilet in the middle of nowhere. After we finished checking it out, we got back to camp, cooked dinner, and settled by the fire. The night was still, and there was no one else around that lake as far as we could tell. No lights, no voices, no distant sounds of other campers. just the steady hum of crickets and the soft ripple of the lake. Later that evening, I decided to make use of the thing. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper and a headlamp and walked over. It was strange sitting out there, completely exposed under the stars. No walls, no privacy, just the forest stretching out in every direction. The moonlight reflected off the lake, and I could see my breath just faintly in the cool air. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt. Odd, sure, but peaceful. For a moment, I thought about the effort it must have taken for someone to carry it up there. A standard toilet weighs a lot, easily over 100 pounds. You'd need a small team or a pack mule just to make it up the first few miles. So whoever had done it either had serious determination or a reason that made no sense to anyone else. The next morning, after breakfast, we went fishing. The toilet was still there, gleaming white in the trees, untouched. I didn't think much of it after that. We caught a few fish, packed up camp, and started the loop back down the mountain. But a week later, when I got home, the curiosity started bothering me again. I mentioned it to a few other backpackers I knew, asking if anyone had ever seen or heard about it. Nobody had. A few people laughed and thought I was joking. One guy said maybe it was part of a research project, or maybe a prank left by some ambitious hikers. But no one had an explanation. Months passed, and it faded to the back of my mind until the following summer. I was on another trip, a different route but not too far from that same area. I ran into a group of rangers doing maintenance work, clearing fallen trees and checking trail conditions. I mentioned the toilet offhand, thinking they might know something. One of them said they'd heard rumors about it. They said they'd checked that lake the previous fall and hadn't found anything. According to them, there was no sign of a toilet, no platform, not even a hole in the ground. Just clean earth and a few rocks that looked like they'd been moved recently. I didn't know what to make of that. Maybe someone took it down, though I couldn't imagine anyone hiking 16 miles just to retrieve a toilet. Maybe it was washed out by a flood, though there hadn't been much rain that season. Maybe it was still up there, just hidden by growth or relocated somewhere nearby. I've gone back to that area since then, passing near the same lake, and I've looked for it, but I've never seen it again. The clearing where it had been looked normal. The trees had filled in more, and the ground looked undisturbed. No sign that anything had ever been dug or built there. It still crosses my mind sometimes, usually when I'm alone out in the woods again. The wilderness has this strange way of holding secrets. You think you know it, the trails, the sounds, the way the light changes, but there are always things out there that don't make sense. I still laugh about it when I think of that day, finding a perfect porcelain toilet sitting proudly in the middle of nowhere. But a part of me also wonders who built it and why. Maybe it was just someone's bizarre project, or maybe it had a purpose I'll never understand. Whatever it was, it's gone now, no trace left behind. Just another odd mystery tucked away in the woods, one that only makes you realize how much goes on out there when no one's around to see it.